Hello and welcome to this episode of the Event Manager Podcast, the podcast for curious event professionals who want to stay ahead of the game. My name is Miguel Neves and I'm the editor-in-chief of Skift Meetings. In this episode titled Facilitating Change, I have the pleasure of speaking with Leanne Hughes, an international consultant, facilitator, trusted advisor and speaker who loves creating unpredictable workshop experiences that predictably work. We cover a lot of topics around change management. Here are some of the highlights. We talk about the difference between facilitating and training. We talk about how the challenge for facilitators is often connecting to business results. We talk about how engagement is just attention in disguise. We talk about how a great event starts way before it has actually started. And we talk about how if you're the same person before and after an event, then that event has failed. And finally, we talk about the acceleration of change as the biggest business challenge up ahead. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation, and I invite you to check out the other episodes of the Event Manager Podcast on our website, or you can subscribe through your favorite podcast service. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Event Manager Podcast. I am delighted to be joined by Leanne Hughes, who's actually, we're connecting pretty much halfway across the world. I'm in Denmark, and you're in Brisbane, Australia, I believe.
Yeah, that's it. So that's the funny thing about these sessions as well, different time zones, right? So different energy levels. It's great to connect with you. Thank you so much for the invite.
Perfect. Well, thank you for making time to be with us today. Wanted to kind of get a little bit of an introduction from you. How did you end up doing what you do today? And then talk to us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, well, I do a few different things, but in the context of event, like this podcast and events, really started off with my experience just being a avid geek of learning and being at workshops. And I'm the type of participant, I'll always raise my hand, I'll always contribute. And then later on in my career, I was going to workshops and events and thinking, I actually think I know more than the speaker that's presenting. And so that gave me the confidence to start leading workshops, which is really about like the event that I really hone in on, that the type of workshop and experiences I deliver. I worked for a global mining company and I was sent to Canada to run leadership training. And I arrived, I was jet lagged. I'd never run this program before. I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and there was a guy in the group that just refused to participate in an activity one afternoon, and it really rattled me, and I didn't know what to do, and I wasn't looking forward to going back and running the session again the next day because he was going to be there. I got back to Australia and I rang up every facilitation friend that I knew and I said, what would you have done in this situation? Because I was very new to running workshops, and that then turned into a podcast called First Time Facilitator, where it's all about finding out what makes a really great workshop experience. And I think the real driver for me is that life is so short. And I get so frustrated when we put all this massive investment of time and energy and resources of bringing people together and an event doesn't deliver, really cheeses me off. So now I sort of bring that element of maximizing time to my work as a consultant, facilitation, and also as a speaker as well.
So you do a number of different things. There's these kind of workshops, you speak, you facilitate. Can you remember when was the first time you really understood or realized there was this kind of event industry and there was this, people that were kind of specialized in kind of putting these things together?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it was when I worked for a very controversial company in Australia called Wicked Camper Vans. Very controversial. You listeners probably haven't heard of them, but we basically got lawsuits every week. My boss, he created these camper vans, which had really controversial quotes spray painted on the back, and that attracted the backpacker industry. And I was working as a marketing evangelist for this company, and I was sent around Australia and New Zealand working at these traveler events. And that's when I realized that this was actually a thing. Talking to the event organizers, seeing the amount of logistics involved in all of that, then having to present as part of that. That also led me to an event in Australia called the ATE, the Australian Tourism Expo, huge event run by Tourism Australia. And I was in awe of the way that they delivered that. Like even the swag that we got these incredible suitcases and just meeting leaders from all around the world. So that was kind of, from a facilitator perspective, just getting insight into that and what made it so great. And I always go to events with that meta lens on why is this so good or why is this not quite right? And it's not just the person showing up, it's the environment that you create, what you do beforehand. So that was it. That was the first sort of, I guess, foray into it.
I think you're preaching to the choir there in
Totally.
a sense. It's like when event professionals go to events, they're always analyzing everything, and it's like you can never. I find, at least when I go to an event and I see something that maybe is not so good or I would have done differently, it always like attracts my attention. I'm like, oh, I don't want to see this anymore. I'm going to look away. I'm going to look over there. And I think it's like if once you see it, you can't unsee it almost.
You can't. It can be annoying because you're supposed to settle in and just relax, but it's also good because you'll take that learning into whatever you design next.
Exactly. I'm sure it's the same. I have to ask, Wicked Campers, what kind of quotes were on these campers that were so controversial?
Well, gosh, I mean, like they literally were controversial. So one was, "I'm not racist. I have a color TV." Like that. That's probably a G-rated one. They got pretty bad. We had one from DHL. So we had a DHL van. It was like yellow and white, and it had the phrase "days and hours late." DHL. So They weren't happy with that. So it was like getting all these companies and politicians, and then just like, being quite controversial. That was how his marketing worked though. So we spent no money on advertising. It was pure word of mouth. It was viral. This is back before social media. And that's how we created buzz. But I had to get out of after a couple of years because then your values are like, I don't know if I resonate with this.
Yeah, there's so much. Yeah, when you're doing it just to get attention, it's sort of, it gets a bit crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I can't... Cool. I can't imagine this company existing today in the way that it was back then.
It's for sure. Let me ask you something we ask a lot of our guests, actually. When you have to explain what you do to somebody that doesn't know the industry, maybe doesn't go to events or some of that, what do you say? How do you go about it?
It depends on actually the person. What's hilarious is in 2019, I actually flew my dad over to India with me. I was running some leadership workshops over in India. And I was telling him about what was going on at the end of every day. Then we got back to Australia and he rings me about 3 months later and he goes, "Leanne, you do things with people, right?" It's like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not being very clear in what I do. But it's really about unlocking that potential, whether it's an individual, a team, or an organization. And that comes in various modalities such as consultant, trainer, or speaker. But I think in the context of events as well, it's unleashing the potential of what can possibly be created when we assemble this group of people together. So that theme of unlocking potential, maximizing the opportunities, that just plays out in all the work that I do. Doesn't matter what modality it is.
Okay. And so take me through, like, I guess, an example, right? I think it's always good to understand. I think the word, I understand what a facilitator is, but even within the realm of facilitation, there's lots of different things, right? You can be sort of more of a moderator, facilitator, kind of just running a conversation on stage or something like that. You can be facilitating dialogue, difficult dialogues. What kind of thing do you like doing the most? Like a company comes to you and says, "Hey, we want to, I don't know, improve our teamwork," or something like that. Is that the kind of question you get? And then how do you, what's like a really good outcome for you? Something that you can kind of see like, yeah, that worked.
Yeah, that's it. I think that often the challenge with facilitators is linking it to a business outcome, because I think you can sort of, with a dotted line, say, right, better communication, better collaboration equals better performance, but it's really hard to draw that direct line to it. And that's actually to communicate our value as facilitators. We need to do that. Some of the gigs that I get, companies. So my favorite gigs are when people say, "Oh, look, we want to create a space where people can connect. We want to improve our team performance." A gig that I've got coming up is with 100 leaders from around Australia. And this company has actually said, "Look, Leanne, we just want to connect. Can you create the space for us to connect?" And sometimes I hear that and you think, well, if I'm to be honest, why don't we just put people in a pub and just run a bar tab, right? Like you can kind of, but obviously I'm kind of like the excuse to do it in a professional way to lead the dialogue. Thereafter, some new ideas on how they can implement their strategy. So it's more about getting this pie in the sky strategy and making it more pragmatic on the ground. So that's one example of like an offsite that I'll run using various tools. But you're absolutely right about the word facilitator. I have a Facebook group called the Flip Chart, and I swear at least once a month, someone will jump in and say, like, what is the difference between a trainer and a facilitator? And we seem to put it under that tag. So my podcast, First Time Facilitator, actually started out when I was a trainer and I was trying to make the content more engaging. But as you said, facilitation is actually working a group through a process towards a desired outcome. And the difference in being, I think, a trainer versus a facilitator is a sense of control. And as a newbie facilitator, my agenda was honestly down to the minute, like 105 to 106, do this. And it was very tight because I didn't have the confidence. The more you develop in the role, the lazier you can be with a group. You trust your process, you trust the group to come along, and you create the dynamic for that to work. So I think there's a spectrum of what is under that. I also love emceeing and posting panel events. And I think what frustrates me when I see some hosts that lead these panel events is that they actually pick speakers that all agree. And that drives me mad. Like, we want some controversy and so I could continue on that rant, but I'll throw it back to you.
No, I think that's super interesting. You mentioned this a little bit. I just wanted to pick on it a little bit. The kind of lack of control. You said lazy, but I'm sure it's not lazy and just like not doing any work. But is there a sort of giving up of control a little bit that you have to have when you do when you're facilitating a group, because you're sure of the outcomes maybe, but you're not really sure how people are going to get there, and you want to kind of push them and pull and see if you can kind of help them get there. Is that sort of the crux of it, or what makes it different? I
think when I accepted that actually control is an illusion, when I accepted that, because what I was trying to do in my role as trainer was to prepare for any possible outcome that was to hit me. And you cannot do that. And that meant I would over prepare. I was quite anxious. But this is back in the early days. And I think you're right. And I do use the word lazy facilitation as a bit of jest, but what it realizes was initially I thought I had to bring all the energy and I was responsible for all of it. And now I realize, no, I think the participants in the group have to bring that as well. I can't manage it, but I can lead it. I can instigate processes. And then my role as a facilitator is to see how I can handle that in the moment, but also not take all that responsibility on. So being lazy is also, throwing questions back to the group. And you mentioned before, yes, we're there to drive an outcome, but I've been in meetings and workshops where after some conversation, we realize the outcome that we wanted to drive is not the outcome. So then you've got to that wasn't on the agenda. So then how do we move forward? Right. So it is. How
do you move forward? I mean, give me an example, because I think that's a really good kind of case study. Because if you kind of like, you go through the process, or you go through some process, and then you realize actually the problem is much deeper, or there's more to unravel here. How do you then kind of switch the goalposts and keep people on track for that?
Yeah, well, I think you've got to actually say it. You've actually got to call out the elephant in the room. And that requires a bit of vulnerability from your end, because you were there to think this is where I'd planned.
That's not my job. I'm just going to take you guys over there, and I'm going to just, that's it.
Can we just park that? Because we need to go into it. It's 1:21 and I had that we would get on. I've had a situation where this happened, there was conflict in this group. And so actually rearranged the furniture, right? So this was a group of 30 leaders that had met. Initially, they were in just sitting around tables. And then we realized that we had to have a deeper conversation. So what I did was I actually got rid of the tables and just got the chairs, and we sat campfire style. And then I set the context. Look, I said, as a group, we've gotten to a stage where this needs to be addressed. I'm going to initiate some questions. We'll have small group discussion, then we'll share back. And even just changing that environment and having that campfire type style created an environment where we were going to move to a deeper way of sharing. But by the way, I was panicking in the moment, what do I do? What do I do? And sometimes it's buying yourself space to make that decision. Sometimes it is just throwing it to the group and going, look, what are solutions? Where do you want to go with the time that we have here? But I think it's very context dependent on what you've observed through the day. And this role as facilitator, it's very draining, because you're constantly looking for cues and signals and trying to read the dynamics of what's going on and making the best assessment on that.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think there's some good tips there. Not that I'm trying to train anybody to be facilitators for the podcast, but I think it's really interesting. I'm interested in this topic, and I think a lot of event planners will be interested as well. I noticed on your website you have, I partner with you to create workplace mojo that drives individual, team, and company performance. How did you get to this tagline? I mean, I'm sure you ummed and ahed and went in all sorts of different directions.
So that's absolutely a temporary tagline that has been on my website for longer than it should have been. Someone said to me, they said to me, you create workplace mojo. And I kind of liked it. So I just threw it on my website. So my approach with anything in life, particularly because we live in a digital world, is that I like something, but I can change it. I'm not really wedded to anything, really. And I think that actually helps as a facilitator and being in events, is that you actually have to be pretty agile. So I liked it at the time. Now that I hear it played back, now that you're saying it to me, I'm like, oh, I wish you hadn't been on my website. But it still attracts the right type of client. And if you do look at my website, I'm not very specific with who it is, but the clients that I work with and attract, and we do some great work together, are the ones that are up for, phrases like that aren't conventional. And that's who I want to attract, as opposed to the black and white type of companies. It
sounds like you don't want to attract somebody that expects to see the full program down to the minute, right?
Well, that's something that I would do, again, as a newbie facilitator and business owner, is that I felt that I had to give clients all of that. But now I've developed a bit more sort of self-worth and I'll push back on that. And it's not a case of saying, trust me, but it's, look, I've got this process, we'll work it through. Obviously different when you're an event manager, because you need to share those details with the client. But as a facilitator, I don't think we should give everything away up front.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. And I also picked up unpredictable workshop experiences that predictably work. You're really playing on the...
I like that. I'll keep that one.
you like the way that sounds, that you still like it, right?
Yeah.
And so, just kind of unpacking that, you're kind of saying, I don't know where we have to go, but I want to assure you that we'll get to a result at the end of that. That's kind of what I'm reading.
We'll get to a predictable result. Yeah. Where it came up was a question I get a lot, and particularly now with the virtual work, is like, how do I increase engagement? And what I think engagement is attention in disguise. I mean, we all know that. And then I ask a bit further, how do you get attention? And what you do is you do things that people aren't expecting. So as a participant, what frustrated me the most was going to a workshop, going in there, sitting down. The host would tell me all about themselves. They'd go through the agenda and housekeeping. And I was like, this is so predictable, mundane, and boring, right? So I'll map that and go, what can I do that's different? So I don't start with housekeeping. I never intro myself at the beginning. I won't even present from the front of the room. Like, I'll actually start the workshop before it's started. I'll do things to mix it up. So they're like, oh, wow, this actually will be a different experience, because the brand of workshops and meetings is so poor. People aren't excited to come to these events, right? And actually that's a good thing for us if you actually are willing to challenge the way that things are done. I just think of what is actually in the structure of any type of event. I think where are some pieces where I can play with that and do something a little bit unpredictable to get the attention.
That sounds like a lot of fun, and that's a really interesting perspective. Because you keep everybody on their toes, right? If they don't know what's going to happen next, then they have to pay attention.
Yeah, and obviously you don't want to push it so far that they don't feel psychologically safe. So you got to there's some rules you play within, there's some rules it is fun. It's very fun to design.
I wanted to ask you sort of a more event-related question. You've been to a lot of events, you speak at events, you facilitate at events, all these kind of things. And I think everybody who's listening believes that events can be life-changing experiences, right? But how do you go, in your mind, what are really like the core things that make an event go from a good event or an average event to a really great event? You know, those things that actually make an event truly memorable. Do you have any particular kind of, notions of what an event has to do to kind of get there?
I feel like every guest will have said this, but absolutely the connection piece. Has every guest said that to you?
It's not an uncommon answer, but tell me what you feel. Like, I think so for event professionals, I think it's important. Yeah, we all want to connect people, but how do you know when you've achieved that, or what does it really mean to connect people, right? Because like you said, let's open up a bar tab. As long as there's free drinks, people will connect, right? And I think sometimes I remember being actually challenged by a facilitator in a really interesting way. So I was kind of making the point that events are great because you have these sort of like after hour bar things and then you chat and it's loads of fun. And she kind of went, well, wait, I think we need to design events that do that without the bar, because, some people are able-bodied and drink alcohol and like that and feel comfortable in those situations. Some don't. And you want to try to include all those people and connect with as many people as you can. Like, how do you, what's a sign of an event that's really doing that well for you?
Yeah, I think it's when it's like a referee in football, right? So you don't notice the referee when they're doing a good job. It's only when you see them and they're visible that you like they're standing out because they're not doing a good job. So I think with any type of event that I run, it is how do I make myself invisible so the group is like leading this and the dynamic is there. When I think of any type of memorable event, the extreme one would be like the Tony Robbins walking on hot coals, like that kind of ritual and moment. But I also think of like this, like the people that I met through there and how we've stayed in contact over that time. But also I have a Spotify playlist. So following Tony Robbins' event, and you can love or he's okay. He's okay. His event was epic, but the anchoring of messages, if you're talking about creating like a lasting change after an event, it's how do you anchor and prime in these messages so that they continue? So after Tony Robbins, I remember there was a Black Eyed Peas song that played on my Spotify recently, and it put me straight back into that Tony Robbins event and that feeling I had. So I think if you want to be smart about an event, is like, how do you create those anchor moments to prime people after it's over? In terms of the connection piece, I mean, the ultimate book on this, The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, I'm again sure this isn't the first time it's been mentioned. The key thing in that I remember is that the event has started before it's even started. And I use that a hell of a lot when I design my sessions. So what I try and do is I try to get to build momentum, excitement before people have even walked in. Where I think events fail is where they design it where, it kicks off at 9 a.m. So we're kicking off at 9 a.m. But there's so much you can do to create rapport, create community, build excitement and energy before people have even arrived at your event. So some examples are, even for the things that I deliver at a small scale would be, creating a video, having a quick survey prompt. Something I'm doing for an upcoming session is, because you mentioned like there's introverts, but people like this group that I'm working with, they've got developers and engineers. So we're just creating these puzzles. We got these trestle tables and we'll have just puzzles people can do before the event has started. So it gives them a prompt to talk to each other, something quite tangible. In terms of events where I've been, I'm trying to think of something that's been epic. So the Gallup Clifton Strengths Conference in Omaha, what they did really well is that everyone is there because we have a love for the strengths tool. Have you heard of the Gallup Strengths tool?
No, if you can expand on that slightly, it would be good.
Yeah, sure. So it's basically one of those sort of fun tools that HR likes to use where you do an assessment, it tells you what your top strengths are and that you have top 5. And obviously everyone attracted to go to that event is obsessed with this tool. So we all get name tags with our top 5 strengths on them. What that means is it pretty much gives you a conversation prompt to just go up to anyone within that event and talk to them about their strengths. So what I call that is reducing the friction of engagement. So I guess that's a design feature. How do you reduce the friction so people are willing to then talk to each other?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because you have a group that's already knows they're connected in some sense, and then there's a conversation started to say, "Oh, I see your top 5." I bet some of those conversations are super awkward, like, "Oh, yours are completely opposite to mine."
They are.
That's interesting.
That's yeah. And there's one called Woo, a strength called Woo, which is winning over others, and that's like the people that enjoy talking to people on aircraft, trains, strangers. So that for me is like at my bottom, like the bottom of my list. But if you see someone with Woo at the top, they're totally up for a chat at any time.
I like it. Woo. Great stuff. You're also organizing an event, or you have organized a few events, the Beyond Bureaucracy event. Is that in-person, virtual? Is it both? How is that planning out?
Yeah, well, we're hoping it's going to be in person, but we've moved it to virtual. And I've done a few events actually recently in the last couple of years where I've collaborated with someone that I've never even met before on an event. So a couple of years ago, my friend Yuri, the Magic Source, he's in Singapore. We collaborated and designed a virtual program just through using WhatsApp. We've never met before. Same with Brendan, who I'm collaborating with this on. Yeah, did you want me to talk about that? Or
just curious about the title, Beyond Bureaucracy. Is that a topic that you work through a lot in your workshops? Is that like a central theme and that's why you're heading in that direction?
Yeah, it's really a sense about when I think about facilitation, what we're really in is the business of change. So I don't think there's a point of hosting anything if there is no change as a result of your intervention. Same with events. This is why I get frustrated with events, is because if you're the same person you were before an event that you are after, I think the event has failed. There needs to be a point for having a live event. So that is all about change. So Beyond Bureaucracy is about change, really. And what I've noticed in organizations is whenever any type of change is released, they just create more paperwork, more bureaucracy, more reporting lines, more hierarchy. And there's no surprise why the change isn't well received. So Beyond Bureaucracy is like, how can you create change in the simplest way possible? That was the premise of it.
And when you say create change, is that like change in the mindset of your team, change in like processes? Does it have a limit, or do you kind of define it in any way?
Yeah, I think it doesn't have a limit because it's really the same way of thinking around it, but it could relate to a restructure. It could relate to adoption of a new software tool. It could relate to a new leader that's joined a team, different dynamics. So the process and will still apply across all of those. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. Cool. It's really important. So you've run 2 podcasts, or maybe more, but I found 2. First Time Facilitator, you mentioned quite a bit already. You did 206 episodes of that, which is very impressive. I think that's a labor of love, I am sure. And now you have a new podcast, Work and Live Large. Why? Well, first of all, why the love for podcasts? And I guess, why did you move on to another podcast? Because I noticed, on the page for your first podcast, now you sort of advertise your second podcast. Are you sort of shifting your focus in a sense?
Yeah, I think I am. I'm growing up with the show. And I think that's what people have loved about the show since it started, is I'm very transparent with where I am. So it began, like I said, from that instance in Canada. And if you listen to early episodes, I really don't have a clue about facilitation, like at all. And then 100 episodes in, it's like, wow, I've actually got all this international workshop experience. Now I've quit my job. I think around episode 60, I quit my job. And then it's all about how I've built up a facilitation business, right? So people love the show because they listen to early days and they go, wow. And I was at a pivot point where I'm like, I'm actually no longer a first-time facilitator. I was talking to podcast guests and I wasn't really hearing anything new. Plus, I see what I do as more as broader than facilitation. But Work and Live Large, that again is a placeholder name. I randomly booked a trip to Las Vegas in February. I booked it on Wednesday and I traveled on Monday. I flew to Vegas to go to an event over there that was held by my business coach, Alan Weiss. I met him on my podcast, First Time Facilitator, and we just connected over Zoom, and I just wanted to be in person. So I did that. It was such a watershed moment for me going to Vegas. When I got back, I just wanted to start podcasting again. I love it because, probably the same reasons that motivate you, just connecting with cool people, having great conversations, learning as you go, using dialogue to refine ideas. But I mean, I pretty much built my brand off the back of that first podcast. So it's been tremendous. Plus, I'm just a huge podcast geek. I listen to so many. And I've managed to, meet some, I don't know, Pat Flynn. I don't know if you've heard of him, Jordan Harbinger. I actually emceed an event where they were speaking in Brisbane and got to hang out at a speaker's retreat with them for 3 days. It's just been the best thing.
That sounds really interesting. I mean, it sounds very much like you're called building in public, right? You're sort of very open about your journey, and I think people are attracted to that, and it's easy to kind of relate to that, and it sounds really interesting. It makes me want to kind of go and listen to the different phases of the First Time Facilitator podcast and kind of understand the journey.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, because the term that I'm using, I'm writing a book proposal at the moment, is called work in public, and exactly it, because I think too often leaders come to me and they go, oh, we need to get some buy-in. And I just think if you're trying to get buy-in, you're too late. You need to get pre-orders. And how do you do that? You share the journey, you share your vulnerability, and that's how it gets more powerful. And often the best episodes on that show have been where listeners have written in about questions, or I'm working on something that I haven't quite figured out, so I share it on the show, and people love it. Like, because you think and it's really like if N equals 1, like I'm the subject, I'm sure someone else will relate to it if you've narrowed down the audience enough.
Really interesting. And so work and live large. It says, what is it? Tune in for upbeat, pragmatic conversations that leave you feeling inspired and wanting to do the thing. Encourage you to dream bigger. I noticed that it doesn't seem, at least at first sight, to have a kind of a steady concept. Like not all the episodes are an hour long. There's some that are 14 minutes long. Is that just kind of the flow, and it's almost daily, right? You're doing quite a number of episodes quite quickly, right?
It was initially, yeah. back to the strengths tool. My number one is ideation, right? And what it is people don't share your process because people don't understand it. So when I talk about it, I'm linked to Activator as well. So I will just jump in and create. And I think that is actually a superpower because there's so many people that I work with in my booked out facilitator course, just my peers, they all want to do things, but they just hold themselves back. Like we literally just hold ourselves back and overthink. So you're asking me about my cadence, and I haven't figured it out. I honestly haven't. When I feel compelled, I'll post something, I'll get some interviews in the bag. I've got this 2 by Tuesday thing, which is all about answering a question using a 2 by 2 matrix. I'm only doing that because I want to develop my skill of visualizing content, right? So something I learned in Vegas from Alan Weiss, he is a prolific publisher. He's published over 60 books. He writes like 15 different email newsletters a week. He's just amazing. And he just says, I write for myself. And so the difference with this podcast and First Time Facilitate is actually I'm just using it as a medium to explore ideas and ways of thinking. And I'm not creating more rules for myself on how I do that. So who knows? It might go to daily. It might be once a month. We don't know. Let's watch this space.
Plus. No, I love your honesty and approach to it. It's very much like I'm just doing it. And if you want to listen, great. Then if you don't, then it's not for you. I think is there, that seems to be a sort of philosophy that comes through in a lot of your work. Is there, would you say that, we need more of that in the world? Like, it feels like.
Of course, I'll say that. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, as someone who, it sounds like you've studied this and you've analyzed this and it's something that you're very conscious of. Could you maybe just explain how you see the benefits of this working out? Because I think, like you said, a lot of people hold themselves back and feel like there has to be a structure and a design and all these kind of things. And it sounds like you're kind of saying, no, you should just go and do it and figure it out as you're doing it, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that comes back to that point around control is an illusion. We actually have no idea what the future will hold. I had a chat to a guy yesterday in Sydney. I flew down, I fly everywhere for these events. I just love them. So I flew down to Sydney for an event run by one of my favorite authors. And I was talking to a guy there and he wanted to start a podcast. He said, but I've got to make sure everything's perfect. Like the audio is good. And I said to him, look, you've just got to start. Like I said, my first 20 episodes were terrible. I cannot listen to myself. However, how did I get better? It was through the process of doing it. Now, in saying that, you've got to reflect as well. You can't just keep doing things and not reflecting on what you're learning or taking experiences into the future and getting feedback along the way. But you cannot will yourself to being a great presenter or podcaster by just thinking and planning. It is all about the action. So I think for me, I use the process of creating as a way to build my brand, as a way to improve. And even on LinkedIn, like probably the most engaged post that I put up or where I'm sharing behind the scenes, like this is how I plan my workshop. People are so curious and geek out on that stuff. So, but yeah, it takes a bit of vulnerability to do that because you've got no idea where this is going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that. I share the same view, and I have to admit I'm probably not quite as tuned into doing this in this way as you are, and I think it's something I could definitely learn. But I find the same thing: social media posts, anything that I can share behind the scenes, anything that I have some vulnerability, or just say like, "Hey, this is how we make this," or "This is what happens." They tend to be really popular, and you can see why, right? People are curious. People want to see how you get to those results, and anything that you can share, I think, is always really fun.
Yeah. I mean, even to the point of my handwriting is really bad, but I'm doing this whole visual mapping and I'm not really there to improve my handwriting. It's like, I'm not going to let it be an obstacle though. And people pay it out, but they're still watching it and they're reaching out to me and it's not polished, right? Yeah. So it works. Yeah,
there's some attraction to that. I mean, there's some theories in the social media space that with the pandemic, there's this sort of like desire to have more raw content rather than the hyper produced sort of videos and that kind of things. So maybe that'll play in our favor and we can just kind of get down to basics, stick with the message rather than get the full production to actually get the message across.
Yeah, that's it. No, good tip.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of go big picture now a little bit. I think we've been talking quite detailed. Of course, also these, facilitation, everything always help with the big picture. We're hopefully kind of leaving the pandemic. I always say hopefully because I never want to say like we're clear and it's all good now and things, but we're traveling, events are happening. Thinking about kind of big business challenges that you see up ahead, obviously the recovery and all these things are still in process, and we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But are you seeing any big business challenges up ahead that are kind of different to what you were seeing before?
I think it's just the acceleration of change and having to be flexible to what is ahead. And as a result, like I've thrown out all the strategic tools that I was using pre-pandemic, I'm not even using now. So I'm at, like the SWOT analysis, I was actually going to do a bit of a rant about what that is, because it's quite static. It's assuming that, okay, this is the external environment, we'll plan it today, but what I've noticed with a lot of businesses is they'll put out a strategy, and within a week things have changed and it is no longer relevant. So I use an approach called sentient strategy, and I think that's working with clients on how do you anticipate and be aware of what's happening in the environment, and then use that to think about the consciousness of your actions. So just remember that we're all part of a broader system, and how can you constantly be looking out and using that framework as a tool to guide your people through making the right decision in the moment, depending on what's actually happening in the environment. And I think that's really the only way. Like anything that's static, even, if you think about the way that org charts work and the hierarchy and structure, I see it moving towards something maybe a bit looser. The fact that we've got this whole new wave of hybrid teams and leaders managing teams that they've never even seen before. This stuff is just, it's going to be more common. It is already now, but I don't think we're moving back to office-based work, even though a lot of companies are trying to drive that. Yeah.
Well, I'm a perfect example of that. I've been working at EventMB for a year and 2 months, something like that. And recently I met the rest of the company for the first time after working for a year online. And it was this very kind of surreal moment of, okay, this is a bit more, everything became a bit more tangible, I think, and a bit more real when you actually kind of meet everybody face to face.
How was that? Can I ask? Because the event that I'm running very soon that's the situation. So tell me, like, how did it feel?
It was good. It was really kind of positive. Obviously, that human connection is very different in person than it is online. I'm a big believer of you can do a lot of things online, but I think when you meet face to face, there's those social moments, those connections, like the way people react to each other in private. Like you don't see that when you're meeting on Zoom. Like if you have a whole team call, everybody's behaving as if they're in a conference room on a whole team call. So to understand the little nuances and little relationships between different people and how they interact with each other and how their body language is, that's super important. And things kind of click into place and you start to kind of make sense and go, okay, I get that dynamic there now a bit. Yeah. But yeah, I think that sort of social interaction, not the what you say, but how you say it and how you stand and how you're interacting with people, that connects the dots. And I just felt so much more integrated into the company and much more part of a bigger team after coming from that experience. Sounds kind of obvious, but it's one of those things like once you live it, you kind of go, okay, that was a little different.
It's so cool. I met a virtual friend at his book launch the other day, and it's like, there's got to be a word between, like, because I was very familiar with Shane through our conversations on Zoom, but then you meet them in person. There's like this, you're not familiar, you're familiar, but you're not unfamiliar, but there's something in between. Like, as you said, there's just that nuance to being in person. It's very cool to hear that.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been a big fan of social media and events for a long time, and there were a number of times way before the pandemic where I'd meet people that I knew through Twitter, and sometimes you'd sort of like, oh, you're that, you'd sort of say their handle name or something on Twitter, and there was a connection. It's not like, oh, we met on Twitter but we're strangers. No, there was definitely a connection. It's still different, but you knew each other, or at least you knew the external personality. So yeah, it's interesting. I can't put my finger on what exactly is different, but the in-person connection is definitely a sort of a different beast in some ways.
It'd be interesting with the whole metaverse, because that's all about being a handle and not who you really are. So that's interesting.
Or being an avatar, right? Like creating your own visual entity, and then how does that play out? And then, fascinating. How do you see that the whole avatar thing? I mean, that's a big question for us. At EventMB, we talk a lot about the innovation and event technology. There's several companies in this space that are building, meet in the virtual world. Several ones that call themselves a metaverse company already. I don't know if I would agree with that, but how do you think that's going to play out in terms of, wearing a headset and kind of connecting with people?
Well, I haven't really looked at it from that angle. What I'm interested in, my friend is into VFriends. He's going to V conference. So what Gary Vee has done there is actually made it back to in-person, but you've got this whole metaverse thing happening. I'm more curious around the community building around what's happening in the metaverse and only communicating via audio as well. Like if you jump into Discord, it's audio only conversations, which are behind the avatar. So you think of, that I find really fascinating, with the ability to be actually someone different in another world. For me, I don't even really know what to think about it just yet without actually having experienced it. I imagine it will take off, like esports is taking off, and the way that we're moving with technology. But for me, I always go into Discord and just go like, wow, like you look at the communities that are thriving, like what are the hosts actually doing in there? What are the admins doing versus the ones that aren't thriving? And again, it's back to commonality, driving for a purpose. And everyone's saying, obviously, community and Web 3.0, it's all built off the back of that.
Absolutely. So what if somebody said, hey, we're doing an event in the metaverse and we need you to facilitate it? What would you say to that?
Of course. Well, you know me. That's it. I'll say yes. And if I can make it up and learn how to do it, I'd absolutely do it. That would be the best. I just have to think, what would my avatar look like? That would be fun.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Want to wrap up there. This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I think we're ending on quite an interesting note of kind of seeing the future in events, and hopefully we'll see you facilitating or moderating or speaking at some virtual and metaverse events. But I wanted to get your recommendation for somebody else who we should have on the podcast. I wanted to just connect the dots as well. You were recommended by Uri Holub, who was one of our first few guests. I think it was episode 5 or 6. So it was really nice to now connect the dots and meet you and have you on the podcast. But can you help us find somebody else who's interesting and would be a good guest?
I think, thanks Uri, shout out to Uri, he's a champion. I think Tim Ferguson, he lives in Switzerland. He runs a company called Audience. And we connected through my podcast, First Time Facilitator. He's just such an active person, great ideas. Canadian, so he's a lovely guy, like all just things that I admire in someone. So I think he'd be a great guest for your show.
Perfect. And let me ask you a further question. What would be a good question to ask Tim as a guest?
A good question to ask Tim.
Like, are there any stories that that it would be fun to kind of get into? I think
it's more about just his ability just to be ever optimistic. And it seems like he's a busy guy, but he always has time for people. And I think because the events industry, like you're constantly thinking ahead and anticipating. Something about Tim, though, he's just very grounded and measured in how he shows up. So I'm curious how he manages the dynamics of a crazy events world and managing multiple clients around the world versus just always being super cool, patient, and measured.
Sounds like an excellent quality to have. I'm sure he's developed it too.
I wish I had that. Yeah.
Well, you've made time to be with us today, so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, and we look forward to following your podcast and all the other great things that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for a wonderful interview. It's been great chatting.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Event Manager Podcast. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. For the latest news and the best articles on technology and innovation in the event industry, head over to eventmb.com.